I had always believed that the worst kind of quiet was the kind you could wear like an old sweater, familiar, comfortable in its weight, and easily mistaken for calm. I discovered on a cold Thanksgiving morning that some quiet is not comfort at all. It is absence disguised as politeness. It is a pocket of silence large enough to swallow you whole. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 73. I live in a split-level house on Maple Ridge with a kitchen that remembers every secret I've ever burned while trying to bake a cake, and a backyard that looks the way a memory feels, softer at the edges, stubbornly vivid where it counts. For 32 years I taught third-grade reading. I knew how to coax a reluctant sentence into a child's mouth. I knew how to catch a lie in the eye of a story. Those skills do not, however, prepare you for the kind of small betrayal that leaves your chest hollow for days. When I first opened my front door that morning, I thought the house smelled like someone had been trimming rosemary, maybe late-night oregano. My son Mark had always liked to rearrange things in the kitchen like a roommate who stayed for dinner and never left his toothbrush. He and his wife Jenna and their two boys, Marcus, aged 12, and Noah, aged 8, were staying with me for the holiday. It was what we had always done. Stuffing, one too many casseroles, stories about relatives no one could remember, and a nap somewhere between pie and the blue Jell-O my mother insisted on bringing. They'd been here for 3 days. I had put up their extra pillows and laughed too loudly at Mark's impressions of our high school history teacher. I had left the back bedroom with the quilt I sewed when Marcus was born, because he always likes to burrow under something that smells like grandma. The note was on the counter, right where I set my reading glasses every night. No signature, just 3 typed lines and a condescending little smile like it could have been written by a travel agent who'd never known a mother's patience. We left for Hawaii, don't wait up. You wouldn't have liked the flight. It was not the words that did the damage, it was the way they sat across from me in that brittle font. The note might as well have been a small, neat brick. At first I laughed because there is a form of laughter that acts like a shield. It hides the way your heart scrambles to find its rhythm again. I read the note twice, then 3 times, then I walked from room to room as if the house might cough up an explanation if I poked hard enough. My slippers found the boys' folded laundry on the couch. Their backpacks were gone. The coffee mugs on the counter were darker where they had sat, a shadow ghost of rings. My phone was on the charger, the screen displaying 2 missed calls from Mark and 1 from Jenna, all time-stamped before sunrise. How thoughtful, I said out loud to no one, the kind of thing you tell yourself so your voice doesn't turn to glass. The oven timer ticked somewhere in a slow, mocking rhythm. I called Mark, straight to voicemail. I called Jenna, straight to voicemail. I waited for the frantic, apologetic call that would explain everything. A surprise for Thanksgiving, an elderly aunt in need, a last-minute business trip. Instead I got 5 hours of emptiness, and then when the calls finally came, 18 missed calls in a neat row that would shape the rest of my week. When they did call, they all expected the same thing. Surprise, maybe a little guilt, a hurried, embarrassed laugh. In my head I could already hear Mark's voice, the one that always climbed up into a tone closer to his teenage years when he wanted to appear casual. Mom, it's just a thing, we needed a break, we booked it last minute. Jenna would add with her practiced warmth, we love you, Evie, we thought you'd be asleep, you would have hated the flight, honestly. The boys would be noisy in the background, the sound of video games or pool chairs scraping a hotel deck. Instead, Mark's voice came through like someone stepping on glass. Mom, we're in Honolulu, we thought you'd be fine. You're in Honolulu, I said. The sentence was a small stone hitting the bottom of a pond. You left me here on Thanksgiving. We thought you'd be better off at home, your knees the plane. He trailed off as his practiced excuses collided with some small shard of empathy. It didn't stick, it evaporated. Did you at least tell me, I asked. Did you call me before you left? Silence, Jenna's breath in the background like someone watching a movie and holding a thought they don't want to say aloud. We left a note, she said finally in the tone of someone describing a lost grocery list. We thought you'd understand. The thing about being older is that you accumulate proof, not the criminal kind. I never wanted anything of that sort, but the documentary kind. I have bank statements filed in labeled folders. I have hospital appointment logs and receipts and a shoebox of old photographs that have the dates on the back. I have the habit, born of years of being told my memory would fail me, of writing things down. You would be surprised how much dignity you can keep if you simply record the world carefully. When my husband died 5 years ago, I kept a ledger of every call, every visitor, every kindness. That ledger kept me sane. It taught me the power of documentation. So I did the only thing that made sense in the sticky, indignant fog after the phone call. I made a list. I wrote the time, the missed calls, the way the house felt like a stage set someone had forgotten to close. I wrote down the last thing Mark had said the night before, a joke about my casserole that had landed on me like an old quilt, and the way his eyes looked embarrassed when he talked about a coworker he had promoted. I wrote down every kindness they'd ever shown, because revenge is not only about retaliation. Sometimes it's about holding up a mirror. I called the credit card company. My hand shook for only a second, then steadied. I had paid for their tickets 2 weeks earlier as a family surprise. It was the sort of thing I did. I liked arranging moments. I liked being the architect of joy, but I had paid the bill. When I explained the situation succinctly with no theatrics, the agent's voice became small and human on the other end. We can place a temporary hold on the charge, she said, or flag the account and issue an inquiry. Put a hold, I said, and mark it as disputed if it goes through while they're in the air. I could hear her typing. I'll note it as possible fraud if you like, ma'am. No, not fraud, I said, not yet, just documentation. A small, practical first move. I knew the law in nothing but the most basic way, but I knew how to make people account. The ledger and the hold were my scaffolding. That afternoon an email arrived from Marcus, a photograph that dropped into my inbox like a live grenade. It was their feet in flip-flops, toes against sand so white it looked like someone had sifted flour across the world. Marcus had written, "Wish you were here, Grandma, pool is sick, lol." There were a dozen heart emojis, no sorry in sight. Hook 1, I put the photograph aside and felt something that at first resembled amusement and then hardened into something sharper. They had taken my holiday and packaged it into their palm like a souvenir. I would not be allowed to be surprised. They had stolen the surprise from me. That little perfect theft sat at the center of everything that followed. Over the next hour, the house became a museum of absence. Their toothbrushes were missing, but their cologne lingered in the bathroom, a cheap citrusy scent that made me feel like an intruder in my own home. The boys' Lego pieces lay in a trail across the downstairs den, the pattern of their disappearance as obvious as footprints in mud. I walked the path and cataloged it like a crime scene, composed and oddly intimate. I told my neighbor Leela, who lived 3 houses down and owned 2 chocolate labs and a civic sense that bordered on heroic. Leela knocked before she entered, as always, and her face when she saw my expression was something Mr. Rogers would have called concerned. "They left?" she asked, stepping into my kitchen as if it were a boat rocking wildly. "For how long?" 5 days, I said. "They're in Hawaii." Leela frowned. She is 58 and works at the county school office, the kind of woman who will file your taxes and your hair into a tidy bun without asking. "Did they tell you anything?" she asked. I told her about the note. I told her about the voicemail. I told her about the photograph. When I finished, Leela's eyes flicked to the calendar on my fridge where I'd scribbled a list of doctor's appointments, checkups, and the upcoming community choir rehearsal, as if I might forget the day the world kept moving without me. "Have you called their friends?" she asked. "Or someone who could make them feel guilty? Sometimes that's the thing." Leela smiled in that way that meant she was plotting. "Also, hey, we could take the family name to the PTA, make them answer." Her humor steadied me in a way I did not expect. Leela's brand of righteous indignation is a small-town specialty. She plotted in short, bright strokes: calls to a mutual friend, a message to the church prayer chain if heartbreak is public, suppose it might mend quicker, and then with the practicality that makes her a beloved member of our block, "Take a walk, Evie. Fresh air is the best kind of plotting." I laughed then, a little because she said plotting with such care, and a little because laughter made my throat rearrange itself back into something less raw. But the laugh did not last. The ledger needed another entry. I had to keep track. Hook 2, when I later checked my voicemail, there were 5 new messages in a row. The first was simple, a grocery delivery confirmation from the morning. The second was from a hospital nurse confirming a routine medication refill. The third was a call from the neighbor across the street asking if I needed anything. The fourth was a number I didn't recognize, a blocked line that played on the edge of menace. The fifth was Mark again, voicemail 2 in the sequence, his voice tightened for the first time, pleading, "Mom, we didn't mean it was supposed to be a surprise. Please forgive us." That last sentence hung in my ear like a photograph left in the rain. I did not forgive them, not yet. Forgiveness is a currency I hoard carefully. I give it where it buys compassion and not where it is demanded like a right. There would be a reckoning, but it would be dignified. It would not involve theatrics, public shaming, or anything that would make me trade my integrity for revenge. I had spent my life teaching children the names of emotions. I knew shame when I saw it, and I knew the slow, accumulative power of proof. So I began to plan. Not vengeance, not in the cartoonish sense. I planned a lesson. It would not be a temper tantrum. It would not be a social media post with tearful subtitles and music. It would be quiet, organized, precise. It would be the kind of response that fits an older woman's hands, steady, intentional, and composed. I thought of the ledger and of the hold I had placed on the charge. I thought of the legal pad under my arm and the list of phone calls I had already made. I thought, too, of the small, vital humiliation of being estimated and filtered, and then left with a polite note. I would return that politeness not with equal force but with a mirror. Hook 3, I would document, I would act. I would wait until the plane landed and they found the travel fund in neutral, the account flagged. The letter explaining in plain terms the hurt they caused, no accusations, simply the facts. You would be amazed how a list of facts delivered calmly can sound like thunder. I spent the rest of the afternoon organizing. I called the bank, which promised to keep the hold in place pending any charge. I scheduled a call with my attorney, a woman named Denise who knew my handwriting from the day I had first signed our wills, and asked what my options were if I wanted to issue a formal complaint for emotional harm. Denise chuckled at the phrase and then, with the kind of seriousness only long friendships afford, explained the boundaries between moral outrage and legal standing. "You're not filing a lawsuit, Evie," she said. "I suspect you don't want that, but I can draft a letter, a measured one, explain the facts. Request reimbursement for expenses if the money is withdrawn. Ask for accountability. Tone matters, you want Pied Piper, not pyrotechnics." Denise's pragmatic calm was water poured on a burning thing. I typed the first draft of that letter that night, sitting at the dining table with a mug of chamomile and the sound of night settling around the house. I wrote, on November 26, 2025, you left my home without prior notification. I stopped. The date felt important. Proper specificity, I told myself, facts anchor indignation. Outside, a fox shouted at the moon like an old woman scolding a bus. I poured another cup of tea and kept writing. Hook 4, I knew then, with the same steady certainty I had teaching children to decode a sentence, that this was not merely about a missed holiday. It was about being seen and acknowledged. It was about teaching them that family is not a commodity you trade without consent. It was about reclaiming what for years I had given freely, my time, my trust, my house. I would make them account for that absence gently, legally, and irrevocably. There are certain satisfactions that are not loud. They are the kind you feel in the small sense of order returned to a life. That night, as I folded the letter into an envelope and set it beside my phone, the house felt the way it had when Mark was small and fell asleep on my chest after a fever. Safe though bruised, waiting, I slept like someone who has decided to act and inacting becomes less fragile. The next morning I woke up to 18 missed calls and a new voicemail from Jenna. Mom, we're on the plane back, she said. We had a change of plans. Flight leaves in 2 hours. We'll be there by tonight. I closed my eyes. Then I opened them and began the work I had planned. When Jenna's voicemail said, we're on the plane back, my first reaction was a small, private relief, the kind you feel when rain finally washes the dust from your favorite dress. I put the phone down, smoothed the tablecloth I'd set out like it was a promise, and told myself I would not be acting out of hurt. I would act like a woman who had paid attention her whole life, clear, logical, and precise. The house smelled of chamomile and old books. I dressed in the sweater Mark once complained made me look like an old librarian, because the irony of wearing his insult while holding my dignity felt delicious. I called Denise before I called anyone else. She answered on the second ring, the sound of her voice making the world feel like a courtroom where you are represented by someone who knows your handwriting. They're on the plane back, she said without surprise, like she had already run the math in her head. They're landing tonight, I said. Flight in 2 hours. Good, Denise said. That gives you time to prepare. Did you keep the documentation, the hold with the bank? I have the hold. I wrote the letter. Leela's bringing over a thermos of something strong and moral support. I heard the clink of the mail slot in the background as if time was delivering little fortuities to me. Keep it simple, Denise advised. Present the facts. Request reimbursement, but also request a conversation at a mediator or with me present if you want to escalate. Tone it like an invitation to repair. Do I want to repair? The question felt immediate, like a bruise. Denise was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, she said the kind of thing people say when they have been both sued and forgiven by the same person. Repair is a process, she said. You can draft it now as an opening. You can open the door or you can wait in the foyer until they come to the threshold. Your choice, but don't berate Evie, that turns the facts into a spectacle. Hook 1, the choice felt bigger than the door. It felt like deciding whether to teach your child how to swim by pushing him in or by setting him on the pool's edge and telling him the rules. I brewed another mug of tea, because habit is a kind of armor, and sat down to rehearse what I would say. I arranged the letter, the bank confirmation, and a printout of the photograph Marcus had sent earlier, the one with their toes in the sand, in a neat stack. While I waited, I revisited the ledger. I turned the pages as if they were a detective's ledger, though I had scribbled only the steady things: dates, bills paid, phone calls made. I read the lines about the Thanksgiving plans, the pie recipe I'd promised to make, the tiny note in the margin where I had written Mark, call Ray flight, the night before. I noticed the pattern of expectation and provision, the centuries of small acts that had become invisible because they were reliable. It is astonishing how invisibility breeds contempt. It is more astonishing how quickly a family will normalize that contempt. Hook 2, outside, Leela's car pulled into my driveway in a way that suggested urgency and moral clarity. She carried a casserole dish like a shield and a look that said she would shout if necessary. I told Mark I'll be waiting in the driveway, she announced, setting the thermos down like it was a legal filing. If he tries anything, I'm going to start a neighborhood petition. Pray for me, I said, and meant it. I felt like an actor about to step on stage, except the stage was my life and the lines were dangerous in their truth. When they arrived, it was not dramatic. There was no cinematic slam of a car door, no crashing soundtrack. The minivan pulled up and Marcus and Noah tumbled out with sand in their sneakers and a smudge of sunscreen on Marcus's cheek like a badge. Mark moved slower, as if the trip had left a small dent in his calm. Jenna smiled mechanically and carried a straw hat like an accessory to a lie. They stood on my porch like people apologizing with their body language but not their words. Mark hugged me first, because that's what you do when you want to appear penitent. His embrace was short and practiced, the way a man learns to compress emotions so they fit inside social expectations. I felt the familiar curve of his shoulder, the scent of his cologne, the citrus smell I recognized from the morning, and I felt more sharply than anything the ledger in my pocket. Mom, Mark said, appropriately soft. We're so sorry, it was a spur. Save it, I said, my voice was quiet. The three-syllable sound of save it is a small surgical thing. It closes the mouth that would talk you into forgiving without listening. Please step inside. They looked at me, then at the doorway, then into the house that still smelled faintly of rosemary. Marcus and Noah tracked sand into the living room. Leela from the driveway raised 2 fingers like a traffic cop. Stay calm. I motioned for them to sit, and they did, lined up on my sofa like a lineup. There was a television playing in muted background, an old sitcom Mark used to watch with me, giving them something to mimic for normalcy. I sat at the dining table and placed the stack in front of me, hands folded like a judge. Denise's words whispered in my head. Tone matters. Before you say anything, I began, and felt the room tilt with attention. I want to tell you what happened while you were gone. They braced, as if a toast was coming or a confession. Jenna's hands fiddled with the hat in her lap. I read the facts slowly, as if each one were a bead. You left this house on the morning of November 26, 2025. You did not inform me beforehand. You left a note that said you wouldn't have liked the flight. You called twice and both calls went to voicemail before dawn. At 10:15 a.m. this morning, Marcus sent me an email with a photograph from the beach. I showed them the photo, letting the sand glint like proof. I called the bank to place a hold on the charge I paid for. The hold is in place. The room felt colder, as if the facts were a window cracked open on a new season. Mark's face flushed in increments, surprise, irritation, then the slow dawning of responsibility. Jenna's mouth formed an O that didn't reach her eyes. Hook 3, why didn't you tell me? I asked, and the question was a small stone that made ripples I had not intended. It was not about the flight or even the sand. It was about the decision that had been made in a corner of their life without consulting the most immediate person to it. Mark's answer was a recitation of convenience and misjudgment. We thought you'd be happier at home. Your knees, we thought the flight was. We thought the boys would be happier in the pool than around the table. It was supposed to be a surprise. A surprise you planned without me, I repeated, on my dime. It wasn't meant to be mean, Jenna said. There was a tremor in her voice now, the kind that reveals the fraying at the edges of a practiced smile. It was mean, I said plainly. It was thoughtless. It was the assumption that I would be invisible. The ledger in my head clicked as if connecting necklace beads. I could feel the history of small invisibilities, the afternoons when I canceled plans because they had other things, the times I had been gently sidelined. You left me a note and a voicemail. You took my money without consent. And you sent me photographs like they were postcards. Mark seemed to shrink and then strengthen, the kind of internal negotiation that men of his generation sometimes need before they can say the words they should. Mom, I thought you'd be upset about the flight. I didn't want to stress you. You could have called, I said. You could have asked me if I wanted to go or if I preferred to be home with my neighbor and my cat. You decided for me, that is the point. There was no malice, Jenna said, voice quavering like a plucked string. No malice, I echoed. No malice is still a decision to exclude. I slid the bank confirmation across the table. It was a small official paper with a stamp and a timestamp that felt like a flourish. I requested a hold on the charge, I said. I did not dispute fraud. I simply asked the bank to flag it pending conversation. If the charge is processed while you're gone, I will ask for reimbursement. Jenna's face showed surprise, then guilt. Mark's jaw worked as if he were trying to swallow a vocabulary of apologies. We can fix it, he said finally. We can. Hook 4. Fixing isn't only reimbursement, I interrupted. The house that had taught me grammar and the firmness of punctuation now taught me to say the full sentence. Fixing is admitting you were wrong, returning what you took without consent, and sitting with me while we talk about why it seemed acceptable to decide for me. I want to know how you made this happen and what you'll do so it won't happen again. They looked at each other, and for the first time since I'd found the note, I saw Mark's face without the practiced levity he used at family gatherings. There was humility there, a thin, new thing that looked like regret. Marcus and Noah fidgeted on the couch, more aware now of being in the center of an adult conversation than of any innocence their ages might afford them. We didn't think it through, Jenna said. We weren't thinking about the hurt it might cause. How do you think that makes me feel? I asked. Invisible, like a prop in the background of your life. My voice was soft, but there was steel underneath it. I'm not a backdrop, Jenna. I'm a person with plans, obligations, and feelings. You cannot pull the rug under me for your joyride. Mark reached for my hand across the table. His fingers were warm and calloused in the way they had been when he was a child and learning to tie knots. Mom, I'm sorry. We were thoughtless. You're right. We should have told you. I let his apology sit like a coin on the table. It was a start, but I needed more than words. I wanted to see action that matched the pen in my hand. Tomorrow, I said, because the measure of a promise is what you do when the adrenaline of the moment fades, I want you to come back here at noon. Bring the receipts, bring the itineraries. Bring proof of what was paid and a note from your hearts explaining why you thought it appropriate to leave without telling me. If you want to make amends, we'll sit and talk. If you want to hide behind surprise and we thought you'd be better off, I will proceed differently. They nodded. It was not an enthusiastic nod. It was the kind you offer when a grown-up is laying down new house rules. Leela, who had been watching from the driveway like a guardian in sensible shoes, took that moment to walk up and hand me a thermos. I'm staying, she said bluntly. If anyone tries to slide out before noon, they'll answer to me in the PTA. Mark smiled, a little embarrassed, and Jenna reached for my hand like someone trying to anchor a raft. We will bring everything, Mark promised. And Mom, please, let's talk, not now but tomorrow. Let us show you we mean it. Hook 5. I let the promise hang there like a curtain. There is something ritualistic about promises, like vows taken in small kitchens instead of in churches. They felt vulnerable, newly minted. I wanted to guard them, but also I wanted to test their tensile strength. That night I sat at the dining table again and added to the ledger. I wrote meeting noon, November 27, 2025, receipts, itineraries, written apology requested. I folded the paper and placed it in an envelope. I wrote on the outside in block letters like a label on a file, accountability. I slept with the window slightly open because the air feels honest that way. I dreamt briefly of a child returning a lost toy and of adults treating that return with the gravity it deserved. Morning found me making coffee and thinking how odd it is that the simplest acts, speaking, listening, returning, require practice for some people. I prepared myself an apple and a plate, because hospitality is an economy and sometimes you teach gentleness by offering a plate. At 11:59 the next day, Mark was the first to arrive. He stood at my threshold holding a thin stack of paper. His hands trembled slightly as he set them on my table. Jenna followed, carrying a small fabric-bound notebook in which she had written in looping script the apology she hoped would be more than an utterance. Marcus and Noah tagged along looking sheepish, their spark of vacation still clinging to them like a wet towel. They placed the receipts and itineraries in front of me like evidence and I checked them carefully, the flight numbers, the hotel booking, the receipts for activities. Everything was there, the sum total of a decision. There was also a little envelope marked from us with love. "Read it when you're ready," Jenna said. Her voice was thin but steady. We wrote it down because we didn't know how to say it with our faces open. I opened the envelope and read the letter slowly. It was honest in the way that suddenly only truth can be, messy, apologetic, and threaded with the clumsy regret of people who had been blind to someone else's feelings. They admitted their thoughtlessness, apologized, and promised steps they would take to make amends. At the bottom, in Marcus's nearly childish handwriting, was a sentence that made my throat swell. "I didn't want Grandma to be sad like my friend Ben's grandma when she gets left out." I looked up at them, and for the first time in a small, quiet day, I felt something approaching relief. They had brought not only receipts but intention. "Thank you," I said. "This is a start." My voice was a little softer than when I'd reprimanded them because that is the mercy of repair. It requires both firmness and the willingness to accept what is offered when it is sincere. Denise had told me tone matters. Leela had told me to be courageous. The ledger had told me to be precise. Now, as they waited for the judgment that would follow their contrition, I realized the truth I had kept like a secret. Accountability is a ladder you climb together. You cannot demand it and then refuse the hands that offer it. "Let's begin," I said. "Tell me how you decided. Walk me through the moment you chose to leave." Mark inhaled, and as he started to tell the story, small decisions turned large, a booking made thoughtlessly, a fear of stressing me out. I realized that this conversation would not be neat. It would be a slow excavation of habits and assumptions. It would be about respect and adulting and the ways we sometimes treat those closest to us as consumers of our happiness rather than participants in it. We spoke until the sun shifted and the light in the kitchen turned the table into something sacred. It was not an exoneration, nor was it a final indictment. It was, in its messy mercy, a beginning. When the conversation broke for a few minutes, Marcus wandered into the den and picked up one of the Lego sets he had abandoned. He held a small figure in his palm and came back to the table. "Grandma," he said, sincerity like a small son, "I'm sorry. I will never send you a beach photo again without inviting you." I laughed then, a sound so bright it was almost foolish. I reached out and took the Lego man from his hand and set it on my palm like a trophy. "That's a start," I said. We returned to talking, this time with Leela offering commentary from the doorway and Denise chiming in by phone like an appointed mediator. The receipts lay between us like a map of a mistake, and there on the map we began to chart a way back. By the time the sun had moved behind the sycamore, I had a sense of how the next weeks would unfold. A mediation session with Denise, a written plan for future holidays, and a bank hold that would be lifted once reimbursement was made. The ledger had a new entry, repair in progress. As they packed their bags back into the minivan that night, there was a tentative warmth in the air. It was not the restored family of greeting card fantasies, but it was something steadier, a recognition of wrong and the willingness to do the small, hard work of making it right. I closed the door behind them with the same calm I had opened it with. The house seemed larger and quieter and strangely safer. I made a last note in the ledger, a small domestic victory, promises document. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened a drawer to the place I kept my pens. There, tucked behind a rubber band and an old receipt, was a small, folded paper, Marcus's drawing from when he was 5, a crude heart with our family inside it. I smoothed it out and smiled. The world is complicated and messy and sometimes cruel, but it is also full of these tiny, stubborn proofs that love, when recognized and tended, can be rebuilt. Outside, the night held its breath. I poured myself a cup of tea and opened the letter I'd written to be mailed, not as an accusation but as a record, a ledger entry of feeling and fact. I placed it on top of the stack of receipts they had left. The paper felt like a promise, and in the end, that is what I needed most, not vengeance, but the satisfaction of being seen and heard and included in the decisions that touched my life. The next week would reveal how honest they were. I could not predict their actions, only hold them accountable for the choices they had already made. I turned off the light and let the house sleep around me, feeling for the first time since that note that silence could be an ally rather than an absence. The week that followed unfolded like a careful negotiation with time itself. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but deliberate. Repair, I learned, does not arrive in one sweeping gesture. It arrives in appointments kept, checks written, conversations not avoided. On Monday morning, Mark transferred the full amount of the travel expenses back into my account. He didn't announce it with fanfare. He texted me a screenshot of the confirmation and wrote only as promised, "Thank you for giving us the chance to make this right." I noted the timestamp in my ledger and felt something loosen in my chest, not forgiveness yet, but acknowledgement. The bank hold was lifted that afternoon. I called the credit card company myself, thanked the agent by name, and closed the loop. Documentation completed. That afternoon, Denise came over in person. She brought a leather folder and the kind of presence that makes people sit straighter without realizing why. We sat at my dining table, the same table where apologies had been placed like offerings, and she reviewed everything with me slowly. "You handled this well," she said, tapping the folder closed. "You didn't escalate emotionally, you protected yourself financially, and you demanded accountability without cruelty. That's rare." "I wasn't trying to punish them," I said. "I was trying to matter." Denise nodded. "And you made that clear." Hook one, matter. The word stayed with me long after she left. For years, I had equated being needed with being loved, babysitting at a moment's notice, paying without being asked, rearranging my calendar to accommodate everyone else's emergencies. I had trained them without meaning to that my time and presence were elastic, stretchable, secondary. This week was not only about what they had done wrong, it was about what I had quietly allowed. On Wednesday, Jenna came alone, no kids, no Mark, just her standing in my doorway with a paper bag and red-rimmed eyes. "I didn't want to hide behind him," she said immediately. "I needed to talk to you woman to woman." I let her in. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't yet sipped. "I grew up in a house where feelings were optional," she said. "We made decisions fast. If someone got hurt, we moved on. I didn't realize until this week how much that shaped me." "And how much it hurt me," I said gently. "Yes," she whispered. "That too." She reached into the paper bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. "This is for you," she said. "Not as an apology gift, I know you hate that, but as a place to write your stories, your days. I realized I don't know enough about you." That landed harder than any accusation. Not knowing is a quiet violence. I accepted the notebook without ceremony and set it beside my ledger. 2 books, one for facts, one for voice. Hook 2, I need you to understand something, I said after a moment. This cannot happen again, not the trip life happens, but the decision-making without me. I am not fragile, I am not ornamental, I am part of this family. Jenna nodded, tears finally spilling. I see that now, and I'm sorry it took hurting you to see it. When she left, the house felt changed, not healed but aware, like a bone that has been reset and wrapped carefully, still tender but aligned. On Friday, Marcus called me from school. He rarely called without prompting. His voice was earnest and a little nervous. "Grandma," he said, "we're doing a thing in class where we write about someone we admire." I picked you. My throat tight. "What did you write?" I asked. "That you don't yell," he said. "That when people mess up you make them explain, and that you don't forget." I laughed softly. "That last part is very true." Hook 3, that evening I stood in my kitchen making soup, the kind that simmers slowly, forgiving you if you step away for a moment. As the carrots softened, I realized something else had shifted. I was no longer waiting for the phone to ring with validation. I was no longer rehearsing what I might say if they disappointed me again. I had already said it. I had written it down. I had enforced it. The power wasn't in freezing the card or gathering receipts. The power was in refusing to disappear quietly. Sunday dinner returned the following week. Not Thanksgiving, nothing that heavy, just soup, bread, and conversation. Mark asked before bringing a dessert. Jenna checked whether Sunday worked for me instead of announcing it. Small changes, but real ones. Halfway through the meal, Mark cleared his throat. "Mom," he said, "we've been talking about Christmas and future trips we want to plan together this time, not assume." "Good," I said, "because assumption is where respect goes to die." They laughed a little sheepishly, but they heard me. Book 4, later that night after they left, I sat alone at the table again, my table, my space, and opened the leather notebook Jenna had given me. On the first page I wrote my name, on the second I wrote the date, and on the third I wrote a sentence I had earned: "I am not invisible and I will no longer live as if I am." I closed the notebook and placed it beside the ledger. 2 truths side by side. One kept me safe, the other kept me whole. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its evening rhythm. A dog barked. A car passed. Somewhere down the block, Leela laughed, a loud, unapologetic sound. I smiled and turned off the light. Some people think revenge is about making someone hurt the way you hurt. I know better now. Real power is quieter. It's reclaiming your place at the table and making sure everyone understands you're not leaving it again. The days that followed felt like winter sunlight, bright, clear, and cold enough to make you notice every breath. I kept writing in the ledger and in Jenna's notebook, side by side, like 2 columns of a life I was learning to read differently. The ledger accounted for facts. The notebook held the interior weather of my days. Together, they taught me how to live with both proof and feeling. One Monday morning, a week after they'd returned, I found an email that made my hands tremble for a reason I didn't expect. It was from Mark's office. The company was sending him on a month-long training in Seattle, a program they'd offered him as a promotion. The training was a long-standing promise, an opportunity he'd wanted for years. My first instinct was to be hurt. It looked like history repeating itself in miniature, decisions being made that tugged at our time together. Then I read more carefully. Mark had CC'd me on the email chain and had written, plain and unadorned, "Mom, I'd like to talk about how we'll balance this. I don't want this to be another time I plan without you." That small, explicit inclusion felt like the hinge we had been creaking open. Gratitude warmed me like sunlight through the kitchen curtains, but gratitude is not a replacement for boundaries. I replied with a list: dates we could schedule, calls, weekends he could fly home, and a line about how if he wanted help with the boys during the month, we would plan it together now, not assume. He answered with a string of hearts and the promise to pin down specifics that evening. It was the kind of work that is both mundane and sacred, the labor of being present on purpose. Hook 1. Not long after, I received a call from Denise. She sounded amused and a little conspiratorial. "I have something for you," she said. "It's pro bono, really a little family covenant template. Consider it legally decorative, but I think it might help you formalize expectations without making it feel like a contract." We met in the park behind the courthouse, the air sharp and dry. She handed me a slim folder with lines I could lean on: expectations for holidays, notation on financial transparency for shared expenses, and a mediation clause if disputes rose again. It was formal enough to be taken seriously and light enough not to make dinner into litigation. I tucked the folder into my bag like armor. Hook 2. The covenant gave language to what I'd been demanding in gestures. When we brought it to the next Sunday dinner, I realized power is often a vocabulary problem. We read it aloud, each person agreeing to a sentence or two. Jenna's voice steadied as she promised to consult before booking anything that affected family plans. Mark agreed to put any future family expenses on a shared calendar to avoid unilateral surprises. Marcus and Noah, who had grown rapidly from children into small citizens, listened and pledged in their boy speech to check with Grandma first when big plans came up. The ritual of stating one's intent was oddly solemn and oddly healing. It did not erase the hurt, but it fashioned a guardrail. Still, life has a way of testing newly laid rails. 2 weeks after the covenant signing, my neighbor Leela knocked on my door, breathless and lit with mischief. "Evie," she said, "I need an accomplice." "What now?" I asked, because Leela's emergencies tend to be the scale of small civic dramas: a lost dog, an overzealous HOA, a bake sale heist. She smiled. "We're having a block potluck to raise money for the community center. I've signed you up to speak." I blinked. "Speak?" "Yes, talk about being seen, about how our elders deserve to be included." "Don't be dramatic, just tell them what you taught me last week, matter." Her tone was equal parts coaxing and firm. "It'll do us good to take the story public." For a moment I considered saying no. I revel in privacy, but the ledger and the notebook had taught me the unexpected calories of saying things aloud. I agreed. Hook 3. The potluck was small and exuberant. Under a canopy of string lights, I stood with the humble authority of someone who has plucked truth from a drawer and polished it for others. I spoke about the Thanksgiving note and about the quiet pattern that allows hurt to be invisible. I said things I had not uttered at their kitchen table: that carelessness is a subtle violence, that inclusion is a practice, and that boundaries are the grammar of love. People listened in a way that felt like bread breaking. Afterwards, no one cheered theatrically. Instead, a dozen hands reached out, neighbors sharing their own small betrayals and the steps they had taken to correct them. The relief I felt was not the vindication I had once fantasized about. It was the more interesting one: communal repair. Returning home that evening, I found a package at my door. Inside was a small framed photograph. Marcus at his school recital, smiling wildly, the same reckless joy that had first made him love the ocean. On the back, Marcus had written in his 12-year-old block letters, "For Grandma, so you don't feel invisible." I cried, the kind of unmilitary crying that eases something taut in your chest. Hook 4. A month later, Mark left for Seattle. He was nervous but committed to keeping the promises we'd all made. We planned visits. I helped him pilot meal schedules for the boys while he was away. And I discovered a surprising rhythm in the absence. It gave me space to consider my own life rather than only to react to theirs. I volunteered at the library again, taking over a reading circle Denise had mentioned to me. I started bringing in Jenna's notebook and reading aloud small entries while the coffee cooled beside me. The children at the library adored me. Their attention is a kind of currency I had not realized I craved. During one of those mornings, a woman approached me after the reading circle. She was in her 60s with hair like silver wire and eyes that held both humor and long conversations. "I heard you speak at Leela's potluck," she said. "My name is Rosa. I wondered if you'd lead a workshop for our senior group on documentation on claiming space." I laughed because the idea of me as a seminar leader was absurd and right. We arranged it before the coffee was cold. Hook 5. The workshop turned into a series. Men and women came with their own ledgers, grocery lists, appointment cards, warranty receipts, and left with the idea that paper could be a kind of witness. The group called themselves The Scene, like a private joke. Our work together wasn't about revenge. It was about equipping each other to insist on presence in a world that too often renders elders decorative. I taught them what Denise had taught me about tone. Theirs were the voices I had once protected with pies and patience. Now they were my collaborators. Home life in parallel did not become a fairy tale. There were relapses. Mark forgot to call once when he was stressed, and Jenna snapped at Noah too quickly one afternoon. We had arguments small and ordinary, and also the sort of conversation that strips you bare. About aging, about finances, about the way resentment accumulates like dust. But the covenant we had signed was a reference point we could return to. When Mark missed a call, he apologized without the defensiveness that used to coat his words. When Jenna recognized a careless tendency, she asked me to remind her gently. It wasn't instant recovery, it was the slow accretion of habit. The boys, who had once thought of me as a stopover between cartoons, began to schedule their own grandma days. Marcus and I would build Lego sets while he narrated YouTube theories with the earnestness of someone discovering the joy of entertaining a different audience. Noah and I planted succulents in mismatched teacups, and he taught me how to beat a level in a game I pretended to understand. These small acts were patchwork repair, not glamorous but real. One afternoon, about 6 months after the Thanksgiving note, I received a surprising invitation to speak at the community college. A sociology class wanted me to tell my story about family dynamics and elder visibility. I prepared a talk that felt honest and not performative. I told them about the ledger and the letter and the small legal language that had helped us speak. I told them about writing in Jenna's notebook when my anger had softened into curiosity. At the end, a young woman approached me with wet eyes. "My grandmother moved in with us last year," she said. I didn't know how to include her. "After hearing you, I made a chart with my family. We included her." She hugged me then briefly and fiercely, like someone who had just been given homework that promised a different kind of future. That month I also wrote an op-ed for the local paper. It was not meant to be scathing or self-serving. I wanted to put words into the public space that could tilt the culture just a fraction, to remind people that the elderly are full citizens in every conversation that touches their lives. The paper printed it with a small portrait of me in the margin, smiling in a way that felt both private and public. The responses were gentle and immediate. Letters, emails, offers to speak on radio shows, and invitations to lead panels. My inbox filled with notes not only from neighbors but from distant readers who had recognized the shadow of invisibility in their own homes. The most meaningful thing, though, was not the public response. It was the way our family continued to negotiate days. Mark no longer assumed, he proposed. Jenna started bringing me into conversations about vacations, about the little repairs on their house, about how to teach the boys responsibility. There were nights when we ate together and the dinner conversation circled between the trivial and the important with a new fluidity. We had not become perfect. Perfection was never the point. We had become intentional. The final reconciliation came in a way that felt both symbolic and ordinary. It was the evening of Marcus's 13th birthday. We had all gathered Mark back from Seattle: Jenna, Marcus, Noah, Leela, Denise, and a handful of neighbors who had become like extended family. The cake was too sweet because someone from the PTA thought birthdays were an enterprise, and the boys had wrapped a gift for me that was half practical, a new set of teacups, and half indulgent, a book of short stories with a dedication from Marcus inside. Marcus stood before the table with that awkward, brave poise of a boy on the edge of adolescence. "Grandma," he said, voice shaking the way honesty does when it first learns to stand up. "I wanted to say thanks for not letting us get away with being selfish, for making us talk, for teaching me to ask." Mark put his hand on my shoulder, a small, familial weight. Jenna reached out and squeezed my hand. Mark's eyes met mine like two adults who had remembered the child who once sat on Grandma's lap. "Mom," he said softly, "I'm grateful you made us see." There was no grand apology then, there was no need for one, only the simpler thing of gratitude. I looked around at the faces that had once fit into my living room like familiar furniture and now sat rearranged by the work we had done. Leela winked at me from across the room, holding up a paper plate with cake like an offering. Denise sat quietly, the kind of reticent pride she saves for the people she knows have done the hard things well. Jenna's eyes were damp but bright. Marcus and Noah were loud and silly and perfectly alive. I realized then that revenge, when it's framed by the language of dignity, can take the shape of repair. My ledger was no longer a weapon, it was a map of what had happened and what we had chosen to do about it. Jenna's notebook kept a record of our interior, whether that sometimes clashed with the facts but often aligned with new intentions. The covenant hung in a drawer, not as an ultimatum but as a humble manual for how to be family without taking one another for granted. At night, after everyone had gone, I sat at the kitchen table with my 2 books and a mug of tea cooling beside me. I wrote a final entry for that year in the ledger: repair accepted, monitored. I underlined it twice. Beneath it, in the notebook Jenna had given me, I wrote, "I matter, I say so. There is a peculiar joy in the ordinary solidity of being recognized. It is not loud. It does not demand headlines. It is the small, insistent fact that you are part of the narrative that guides decisions that affect you." My revenge, if you could call it that, was not about inflicting pain. It was about insisting on my rightful space at the table and then inviting everyone back to sit with us, not as guests, not as spectators, but as participants. Months later, when holidays rolled by with less drama and more planning, I found myself thinking about the power of small acts. The boys learned to ask, Mark learned to include, Jenna learned to check herself before assuming. The neighborhood workshop became a regular thing. The scene expanded to a weekly session where people traded ledgers like talismans. Leela continued to be Leela, fierce, hilarious, and undeterred. Denise kept the folder of formalities updated with a lawyerly affection. I kept writing. On the last page of Jenna's notebook, a year after the note that had started it all, I wrote a line that felt both modest and triumphant. There are many ways to reclaim a life. Mine is to be steady, clear, and visible. I closed the book, set the ledger beside it, and turned off the kitchen light. The house held its breath around me, not the absence it once was, but a roomy, practiced silence that had learned how to include. I walked to the window and watched the sycamore leaves move in a wind that smelled faintly of new rain. The shape of my life was no longer something to be assumed about. It was an address I lived at, and I had learned how to guard it with the soft ferocity of a woman who knows her own worth.